The United States has long positioned itself as a loyal ally, but history tells a harsher story. Again and again, the US turned its back on partners when it suited political interests, often with devastating consequences. Here are 10 shocking betrayals where America abandoned its supposed friends at their most desperate moments. Number 1. The Indian Removal Act, America's betrayal of native allies, 1830. For decades, the United States signed treaties with native nations like the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole, promising to protect their ancestral lands. But in 1830, President Andrew Jackson pushed through the Indian Removal Act, authorizing forced relocation west of the Mississippi River. Even after the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokee in Worcester versus Georgia, Jackson ignored the decision. Thousands were marched from their homes at gunpoint. The Trail of Tears claimed up to 15,000 lives through starvation, disease, and brutal conditions. Native allies who once trusted American promises were left devastated and forgotten. Number 2. The Sudden Cut of Lenleys to the USSR. During World War II, the US supplied over $11 billion worth of weapons, food, trucks, and planes to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program, a staggering figure, equivalent to about $180 billion today. The Soviets received over 400,000 trucks, 13,000 tanks, 14,000 airplanes, and vast amounts of raw materials, which were crucial for their survival against Hitler's forces. Yet on May 11, 1945, just 3 days after Germany's surrender, President Harry Truman abruptly cancelled all shipments, including cargo already crossing the Atlantic. Even goods like medicine and food were stopped. Adding insult to injury, Washington demanded repayment for remaining supplies, over $1.3 billion, which Stalin refused. This betrayal shocked the Kremlin and signaled that wartime friendship was over. The abrupt cutoff directly contributed to the growing distrust that ignited the Cold War. Number 3. The Abandonment of South Vietnam. From 1965 to 1973, America spent over $120 billion trying to prevent the spread of communism in Vietnam, at the cost of more than 58,000 American lives. South Vietnam became almost entirely dependent on U.S. firepower and financial aid. But after the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, U.S. troops withdrew, promising continued support, promises that quickly faded. When North Vietnamese forces launched their final offensive in early 1975, President Gerald Ford requested emergency aid for South Vietnam, but Congress refused. Desperate South Vietnamese leaders begged for help as their army collapsed. On April 30, 1975, as Saigon fell, U.S. helicopters evacuated American officials and a handful of allies. Thousands of South Vietnamese who had trusted Washington were left behind. Many faced torture, execution, or imprisonment in brutal re-education camps. The desperate scenes at the U.S. Embassy rooftop became an enduring symbol of betrayal. Number 4. Hungary's crushed uprising, 1956. Inspired by American promises of freedom and encouraged by Radio Free Europe broadcasts, the people of Hungary rose against Soviet domination in October 1956. For 2 weeks, Hungarian fighters battled Soviet troops in the streets of Budapest, believing American help was imminent. CIA operations had hinted at possible intervention. But when Soviet tanks returned in force on November 4, President Eisenhower decided against any military action, fearing nuclear escalation with Moscow. Over 2,500 Hungarians were killed, thousands more were imprisoned, executed, or forced into exile. Despite all the rhetoric, Hungary was abandoned to Soviet reoccupation. It sent a chilling message to all of Eastern Europe: America's support might end at the water's edge. Number 5. Betraying the Kurds, 1975, 1991, 2019. Few groups have learned more painfully that American promises can be broken than the Kurds. In 1975, encouraged by the CIA, Kurdish rebels rose against Saddam Hussein. But after Iran and Iraq reached an agreement, U.S. support was abruptly cut off, leaving the Kurds defenseless. Thousands were slaughtered. In 1991, after the Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush encouraged Iraqi Kurds to rise again, but when Saddam retaliated, American forces stayed idle. Kurdish villages were bombed, civilians massacred. In 2019, history repeated itself. After years of cooperation fighting ISIS, President Trump withdrew U.S. troops from northern Syria, clearing the way for a Turkish assault that displaced over 200,000 Kurds. Henry Kissinger's cold remark decades earlier still echoed, "Promises to Kurds aren't legally binding." Once again, Kurdish allies paid the price. Number 6. Bay of Pigs, a mission betrayed. In 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained by the CIA, landed at Playa Girón, hoping to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist regime. The plan had been greenlit under Eisenhower and continued under John F. Kennedy, with promises of U.S. air support. Yet at the last moment, JFK canceled critical airstrikes, fearing global outrage. Without American backing, the exiles were overwhelmed. Over 100 were killed, and more than 1,100 were captured. Many faced years of brutal imprisonment in Cuba. The Bay of Pigs became a humiliation for U.S. foreign policy and drove Castro deeper into Soviet arms, setting the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis just 1 year later. Number 7. The Sha of Iran, America's forsaken ally. For a quarter century, America had supported Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi with military aid, CIA assistance, and political backing, seeing him as a pillar against Soviet expansion in the Middle East. The Shah's regime was increasingly authoritarian, with the Savak secret police brutally suppressing dissent. But when massive protests erupted in 1978, the Carter administration hesitated, sending mixed signals. Fearing instability, Washington slowly withdrew its support. In January 1979, the Shah fled Iran. When he later entered the U.S. for medical treatment, Iranian anger exploded, culminating in the seizure of the U.S. embassy and the hostage crisis. The betrayal of the Shah cost America one of its most strategically valuable allies and led to 4 decades of bitter enmity with the Islamic Republic. Number 8. Chiang Kaishek in Taiwan's isolation, 1949 to 1979. During World War II, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces received billions in American aid to fight Japan and, later, Mao's communists. But after 1945, U.S. support dwindled as corruption, inefficiency, and battlefield losses plagued the Kuomintang. In 1949, Mao's forces captured Beijing, and Chiang fled to Taiwan with 2 million followers. For years, Washington insisted Taiwan was the real China. But by the 1970s, under President Nixon's opening to Beijing, American policy shifted. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter formally recognized the People's Republic of China, cutting official ties with Taiwan. A loyal ally, who had fought alongside America in World War II, was left diplomatically isolated, a reality that shapes tensions today across the Taiwan Strait. Number 9. Afghanistan, abandoned twice, 1989 and 2021. In the 1980s, the U.S. funneled billions to Afghan Mujahideen fighters to bleed Soviet forces. After the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, American interest evaporated. Afghanistan plunged into civil war, creating a power vacuum that eventually birthed the Taliban and later provided safe haven to Al-Qaeda. In 2021, history repeated itself when President Biden ordered a sudden withdrawal of U.S. troops. The Afghan government collapsed almost overnight. Images of Afghans clinging to U.S. military planes during evacuation shocked the world. Thousands of interpreters and local allies who had served American forces were left behind to face Taliban revenge, despite repeated promises of safety. Number 10. Iraqi translators left behind. Between 2003 and 2011, over 50,000 Iraqis served as interpreters, drivers, and guides for American forces. They faced constant death threats from insurgents, labeled as traitors for helping the occupiers. The U.S. government promised special immigrant visas to those who served, but bureaucratic delays and political inaction left thousands stranded. As violence escalated, many translators were hunted down and murdered while waiting for paperwork that never came. One translator, Johnny Walker, who survived, later wrote, "We were disposable, used, then forgotten." Their abandonment stands as one of the most shameful betrayals in modern American history.